The bells of St. Bartholomew's rang out across the village of Little Furlong with the particular joy reserved for weddings, their bronze voices carrying promises across cottage gardens, heavy with June roses, and into the hearts of those who still believed in happy endings. Miss Jane Marple, adjusting her best lavender silk and securing her hat with a pearl-headed pin that had belonged to her dear mother, paused at her garden gate to listen to their melodious proclamation. At 73, she had witnessed enough weddings to know that they were rather like theatrical productions, most delightful when everything proceeded according to plan, and most illuminating when they did not. Today's ceremony promised to be particularly interesting. Miss Sylvia Hartwell, the daughter of the village's most respected solicitor, was marrying Captain Daniel Ashford, a distinguished gentleman who had recently returned from service in India. The match had been the subject of considerable village discussion for months, mostly favorable, though Miss Marple's keen blue eyes had detected undercurrents of something rather more complex beneath the surface of general approval. The ancient stone church was filling rapidly with what appeared to be the entire population of Little Furlong and several neighboring villages. Miss Marple took her customary position near the back, close enough to observe without appearing to do so, far enough from the altar to avoid the more effusive displays of emotion that weddings invariably produced. From this vantage point, she could see the assembled congregation, Mrs. Dolly Bantry, resplendent in rose silk, Colonel and Mrs. Melchett maintaining their usual dignified reserve, and Dr. Haydock looking slightly harried, as he always did when called away from his patients for social occasions. The bride's party had already assembled at the front of the church. Mrs. Hartwell, elegant in deep blue, dabbed occasionally at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, while Mr. Hartwell stood beside her with the particular stiffness of a father about to give away his only daughter. The bridesmaids, 3 young ladies from the county families, whispered among themselves with barely contained excitement, their pastel gowns creating a charming tableau against the ancient stonework. Captain Ashford waited at the altar with his best man, a tall, rather intense gentleman with military bearing whom Miss Marple had heard introduced as Major Wickham. The groom appeared every inch the perfect bridegroom in his morning dress, though Miss Marple's practiced eye noted a certain tension in his shoulders and a habit of glancing toward the church doors with what might have been anxiety rather than mere anticipation. At precisely 11 o'clock, the organ swelled into the familiar strains of the wedding march, and all heads turned expectantly toward the back of the church. Sylvia Hartwell appeared in the doorway on her father's arm, and a collective sigh of admiration rose from the congregation. She was indeed beautiful, with her auburn hair arranged in elegant waves beneath her grandmother's Brussels lace veil, and her ivory silk gown trailing behind her in graceful folds. The bride carried a bouquet of white roses and orange blossoms, traditional symbols of purity and fertility, though Miss Marple noticed with interest that tucked discreetly among the blooms was a sprig of rosemary for remembrance. Yet as Miss Marple studied the bride's face during her processional down the aisle, she observed something that others might have missed. Beneath the radiant smile expected of every bride, there was a tightness around Sylvia's eyes, a barely perceptible tremor in her gloved hands as she clutched her bouquet. It was the look of someone carrying a secret, Miss Marple reflected, and secrets at weddings were rarely of the pleasant variety. The ceremony proceeded with the Reverend Clement's usual dignity through the familiar liturgy. The ancient words of commitment echoed through the stone arches, binding 2 lives together in the sight of God in the village. Miss Marple found herself studying not the happy couple, but the faces of the congregation, noting the various expressions of joy, approval, and, in 1 or 2 cases, something that looked rather more like concern. Mrs. Price Ridley, the village's most accomplished purveyor of gossip, was whispering rather urgently to her companion, Mrs. Hartnell. Miss Marple caught only fragments, always wondered if it would actually happen, and complications that some people prefer to forget. Such comments, delivered with Mrs. Price Ridley's particular brand of malicious satisfaction, suggested that the path to this altar had not been entirely smooth. The exchange of vows proceeded without incident, though Miss Marple noticed that when Captain Ashford slipped the ring onto Sylvia's finger, his hands were not entirely steady. The bride's responses were clear and firm, but there was something in her voice, a note of determination rather than joy, that struck Miss Marple as curious. Following the ceremony, the wedding party retreated to the vestry for the signing of the register, a tradition that always provided a brief respite for the congregation to relax and exchange pleasantries. It was during this interlude that Miss Marple made several small observations that would later prove significant. She noticed that Dr. Haydock had positioned himself near the vestry door with the alertness of a man expecting to be needed. She observed that Major Wickham had seemed unusually pale throughout the ceremony, occasionally pressing his hand to his chest as if experiencing some discomfort. Most intriguingly, she had seen Mrs. Hartwell slip a small envelope to her daughter just before the processional, a gesture so quick and furtive that it suggested the contents were of a private and possibly urgent nature. The congregation waited patiently, the gentle murmur of conversation, punctuated by the occasional laugh and the rustle of silk and taffeta. Children fidgeted in their best clothes while their mothers made futile attempts to keep them tidy. The June sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, casting jeweled patterns across the ancient flagstones. Then, quite suddenly, the peaceful atmosphere was shattered. A scream, high, sharp, and unmistakably filled with terror, pierced the air from the direction of the vestry. The congregation fell silent, every head turning toward the heavy oak door behind which the wedding party had disappeared. The scream was followed by the sound of something heavy falling, then voices raised in alarm and confusion. Dr. Haydock was the first to move, striding quickly toward the vestry with the purposeful gait of a man accustomed to emergencies. The Reverend Clement appeared in the doorway, his usually composed face pale with shock, his hands trembling as he gestured for calm. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice barely steady, "I'm afraid there has been a most distressing incident. We must ask for your patience while that is to say." He paused, clearly struggling with how to convey whatever catastrophe had occurred behind the vestry door. Dr. Haydock emerged from the vestry, supporting a visibly shaken Sylvia Hartwell, still in her wedding gown, but now as pale as her ivory silk. Behind them came Captain Ashford, his morning dress disheveled, his face grim with an expression that spoke of shock and something approaching horror. "I regret to inform you," Dr. Haydock announced in his professional voice, though Miss Marple could detect the underlying strain, "that there has been a serious incident involving Major Wickham. The gentleman appears to have suffered some form of collapse. I'm very much afraid that Major Wickham is dead." The silence that followed this announcement was profound and terrible. Then, as if a spell had been broken, the church erupted into exclamations of shock, horror, and disbelief. Ladies began to weep, gentlemen demanded explanations, and children, sensing the adult distress around them, began to wail in sympathy. Through it all, Miss Marple remained seated quietly in her pew, her hands folded peacefully in her lap, her mild blue eyes taking in every reaction, every expression of surprise or grief. She noted who appeared genuinely shocked and who seemed merely to be performing the expected response. She observed the way Captain Ashford's hand trembled as he supported his new bride, and the manner in which Mrs. Hartwell had gone perfectly still, as if carved from marble. Most significantly, she noticed the small white envelope that had fallen from Sylvia's bouquet during the commotion, the same envelope she had seen Mrs. Hartwell pass to her daughter before the ceremony. It lay now on the flagstones just outside the vestry door, its contents apparently forgotten in the chaos of the moment. Miss Marple rose quietly from her pew, and, with the unobtrusive efficiency that had served her well in countless similar situations, retrieved the envelope before anyone else noticed it. The paper was expensive, the handwriting feminine and urgent. Though she did not open it immediately, she could feel that it contained more than a simple note. There was something small and hard within, possibly a key. As the village constable arrived and began the process of securing the scene, and as Dr. Haydock gently but firmly moved the congregation toward the church doors, Miss Marple reflected that what had begun as a perfectly ordinary wedding had transformed into something far more complex and dangerous. Major Wickham was dead, the bride was in shock, and somewhere in the tangle of relationships and secrets that made up village life lay the explanation for this tragedy. She tucked the envelope discreetly into her handbag, next to her knitting, and prepared to do what she did best: observe, listen, and slowly untangle the threads that bound together the truth of what had really happened on this most unfortunate wedding day. The bells of St. Bartholomew's had fallen silent now, their joyous proclamation replaced by the somber reality that in Little Furlong, as in villages everywhere, the most ordinary days could conceal the most extraordinary secrets. The congregation emerged from St. Bartholomew's into sunlight that seemed to have lost its celebratory warmth, the joyous pealing of the wedding bells now a memory displaced by whispered speculation and shocked murmurs. Miss Marple moved with the dispersing crowd, her practiced eye cataloguing the various reactions as people processed what had just occurred within the sacred walls of their village church. The village responds. Mrs. Price Ridley had positioned herself strategically near the church gate, already holding court with the particular satisfaction of one whose dramatic instincts had been vindicated. I always said there was something not quite right about military men returning from India, she declared to her eager audience, though Miss Marple rather doubted Mrs. Price Ridley had harbored any specific suspicions about Major Wickham before this moment. All those tropical diseases and exotic ailments, mark my words, it will prove to be something foreign and unsettling. Mrs. Hartnell, ever her faithful echo, nodded with grave authority. Indeed, the Constitution suffers terribly in such climates, and the stress of military service, it catches up with a man eventually, doesn't it? But Mr. Giles, the village butcher, voiced what others were thinking but hesitant to say aloud. Begging your pardon, ladies, but healthy men don't just collapse and die at wedding ceremonies. Someone must have done something. Stands to reason, doesn't it? His words sent a visible shiver through the small crowd, giving voice to the unspoken fear that had begun to take root in several minds. Miss Marple noted with interest how the theories varied according to the speaker's temperaments, those who preferred tidy explanations gravitating toward natural causes, while those with more dramatic inclinations immediately suspected foul play. Official concerns. Near the church steps, Colonel Melchett was engaged in urgent, low-voiced conversation with Dr. Haydock, their military bearing evident even in civilian dress. Miss Marple, adjusting her gloves with deliberate care, positioned herself within earshot of their exchange. Natural causes, you think? Colonel Melchett was asking, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer would not be reassuring. Dr. Haydock's response was troubled and measured. I cannot say definitively without proper examination, but the symptoms I observed were concerning. The facial discoloration, the suddenness of the collapse, certain other indicators, it suggests something rather more serious than a simple heart attack or stroke. You're suggesting poison. The colonel's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. I'm suggesting we need to be extremely careful about drawing hasty conclusions, Dr. Haydock replied diplomatically, but Miss Marple caught the meaningful look that passed between the two men. The arrival of Inspector Slack from the county constabulary brought an air of official authority to the proceedings. Though Miss Marple had encountered the inspector before and held reservations about his investigative methods, he was a man of considerable self-importance and limited imagination, qualities that had led to unfortunate oversights in previous cases. Right then, Inspector Slack announced with unnecessary volume, natural death most likely. These military fellows often have weak hearts from foreign service. Still, we'll follow proper procedures. Can't have people saying we didn't do our job thoroughly. Dr. Haydock approached the inspector with obvious reluctance. Inspector, I feel compelled to mention that the circumstances of Major Wickham's death may warrant closer examination. The gentleman had recently undergone a comprehensive medical examination for insurance purposes, just 3 weeks ago, in fact, and was pronounced to be in excellent health. Inspector Slack waved dismissively. Doctor, I appreciate your medical expertise, but I've seen plenty of sudden deaths. Perfectly natural for a man of his background. These insurance examinations don't account for everything. Stress, excitement, the strain of standing through a long ceremony. Miss Marple found herself increasingly concerned about the direction the investigation was taking. The inspector's determination to classify this as natural causes, combined with his dismissive attitude toward Dr. Haydock's professional observations, suggested that crucial evidence might be overlooked or dismissed entirely. Subtle investigations. Moving with the unobtrusive efficiency that had served her well in countless social situations, Miss Marple began to circulate among the remaining guests, offering gentle condolences while listening carefully to their responses. From the bridesmaids, she learned that Major Wickham had seemed perfectly charming during the wedding preparations, though Miss Jennifer Fortescue mentioned with a slight frown that he had appeared distracted during the rehearsal. He kept checking his pocket watch, she confided, as if he had somewhere else he needed to be, and he asked the oddest questions about the church, how long it had been there, whether there were any old crypts or hidden passages. Rather strange conversation for a wedding rehearsal, wouldn't you say? Miss Marple agreed that it was indeed unusual, and filed this information away for future consideration. She was beginning to form a picture of Major Wickham as a man with concerns beyond the immediate festivities, possibly relating to some business or personal matter that had been weighing on his mind. Her quiet investigation was interrupted by a detail that caught her attention during Inspector Slack's preliminary examination of the vestry. The Reverend Clement, still pale with shock, was explaining the sequence of events to the inspector with the precision of a man accustomed to ritual. "We had the register prepared, the pen filled," he was saying. "Miss Sylvia, that is, Mrs. Ashford, had just signed her name. There was a moment when the gentlemen were greeting one another, a jest of some sort. Major Wickham mentioned hoping the bride wouldn't change her mind at the last minute, said people make the strangest errors. Then we offered the wedding favors. Mrs. Hartwell had insisted on having them." "Wedding favors?" Inspector Slack asked with mild interest. "Small packets of sugared almonds," Mrs. Hartwell interjected, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "Sylvia and I had tied all the ribbons ourselves just yesterday. We thought it would be cheerful while the papers were being arranged." Miss Marple's attention sharpened considerably at this detail. Sugared almonds. Small, easily consumed, and an innocent tradition that would arouse no suspicion if one particular packet contained something other than confection. The envelope's secret later, in the privacy of her cottage, Miss Marple finally examined the envelope she had retrieved from the church floor. The expensive paper bore Mrs. Hartwell's distinctive handwriting, and inside she found not only a brief note, but also a small brass key with a ridged bow that suggested it had been made for a modern lock. The note was brief but telling. "Top drawer. You must read what's there before you sign anything. The key is for the desk in the morning room. Trust no one else with this." Mother. Miss Marple studied the key thoughtfully, remembering that the Hartwells had retained several pieces of antique furniture when they had modernized their home, including an old escritoire with brass fittings that had belonged to Mrs. Hartwell's family. Whatever was hidden in that desk had been important, enough for Mrs. Hartwell to risk passing the key to her daughter at the very moment of her wedding ceremony. The implications were troubling. If Mrs. Hartwell had felt compelled to warn her daughter against signing something, presumably related to the wedding or the marriage settlement, it suggested that there were aspects of this union that were not as straightforward as they appeared. And if Major Wickham's death was indeed the result of poison, as Dr. Haydock suspected, then someone had gone to considerable lengths to prevent whatever transaction or revelation might have occurred after the ceremony. Gathering threads. As evening approached, Miss Marple reflected on the various threads she had begun to gather. Major Wickham, recently certified as healthy, had died suddenly after consuming wedding favors. Mrs. Hartwell had felt it necessary to secretly provide her daughter with access to hidden documents. The bride herself had shown signs of distress that went beyond normal wedding nerves, and somewhere in the complex web of village relationships and family secrets lay the motive for what was beginning to look very much like a carefully planned murder. The official investigation would proceed along predictable lines, with Inspector Slack's determination to classify the death as natural causes likely to prevent any thorough examination of the evidence. But Miss Marple had learned long ago that the most important clues often lay not in the obvious places where investigators looked, but in the small, seemingly insignificant details that revealed the true nature of human relationships and motivations. Tomorrow would bring formal statements and official procedures, but tonight Miss Marple sat by her window with her knitting, watching the lights in the Hartwell house, and wondering what secrets lay hidden in the top drawer of an antique desk, and whether those secrets had been worth killing to protect. The wedding day that had begun with such promise had ended in tragedy and suspicion, but Miss Marple knew that in the quiet corners of village life, where people's true natures revealed themselves in unguarded moments, the truth would eventually emerge. It always did, for those who knew how to look for it. The morning after the wedding brought a peculiar quality to Little Furlong, as if the very air had thickened with unspoken questions. Miss Marple rose early, as was her custom, and found herself drawn to her front garden where the roses required dead-heading, a task that provided the perfect vantage point for observing the village's response to yesterday's tragedy. The usual rhythms of village life continued, but with an undercurrent of tension that colored every interaction. Mrs. Lumley at the village shop had already established herself as the unofficial center of speculation, her counter serving as a gathering point for those hungry for information. Miss Marple made her customary morning visit, selecting a tin of Earl Grey while listening to the theories that flowed as freely as the tea that would soon brew from her purchase. "Such a shock, wasn't it, Miss Marple?" Mrs. Lumley began, her voice carrying the particular tone reserved for momentous occasions. Poor Major Wickham, and him looking so well at the ceremony. Dr. Haydock was called back to examine the gentleman again this morning, you know. Most unusual, that is. Mr. Davies, the postman, nodded gravely as he sorted through his letters. "My wife saw the doctor's motor car heading toward the church before dawn. That's not the behavior of a man satisfied with natural causes, if you ask me." Miss Marple murmured appropriate responses while noting the various reactions around her. Some villagers seemed genuinely distressed by the tragedy, while others displayed the barely concealed excitement that often accompanies dramatic events in otherwise quiet communities. Human nature, she reflected, was remarkably consistent in its responses to crisis. Her observations were interrupted by the sight of Dr. Haydock's familiar figure approaching the shop. The good doctor appeared tired, his usually composed demeanor showing signs of strain. When he entered, the conversation naturally turned to his professional assessment of the situation. "Doctor," Mrs. Lumley ventured carefully, "we've all been wondering about poor Major Wickham. Such a sudden thing, wasn't it?" Dr. Haydock chose his words with the precision of a man walking through a minefield. "I'm afraid there are aspects of the gentleman's condition that require further examination. Inspector Slack has been most cooperative in arranging for a proper post-mortem to be conducted." Miss Marple noted the careful phrasing. In her experience, when Dr. Haydock spoke of aspects that require further examination, he was diplomatically indicating his suspicions without making accusations that might later prove embarrassing. The fact that he had persuaded Inspector Slack to order a post-mortem suggested that his medical concerns were compelling indeed. After completing her shopping, Miss Marple made her way toward the Hartwell residence, ostensibly to offer condolences to the bride's family. The house stood in dignified seclusion behind its sweep of gravel, but Miss Marple's practiced eye noted signs of disturbance in the household routine. The curtains in the morning room were still drawn, most unusual for a family that prided itself on maintaining proper appearances. Mrs. Hartwell received her in the drawing room, her usual composure intact, but showing subtle signs of strain. The lady of the house was dressed in subdued colors, her manner suggesting someone who had spent a sleepless night wrestling with difficult decisions. "Miss Marple, how kind of you to call," Mrs. Hartwell said, though her voice carried an undertone of wariness. "These have been most trying circumstances for all of us." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied gently. "I wondered how dear Sylvia was bearing up under the shock. Such a terrible thing to happen on what should have been the happiest day of her life." Mrs. Hartwell's composure flickered slightly. "She is resting. Dr. Haydock has been most attentive, but the shock has been considerable." She paused, seeming to weigh her words carefully. "There have been complications beyond the immediate tragedy." It was then that Miss Marple produced the envelope she had retrieved from the church floor. "I believe this belongs to Sylvia. It fell from her bouquet during the disturbance yesterday." Mrs. Hartwell's reaction was immediate and telling. Her eyes went directly to the envelope, and relief flickered across her features before being quickly suppressed. "Thank you. I feared it had been lost in all the confusion." The significance of the envelope's contents became clear when Mrs. Hartwell, after a moment's hesitation, decided to confide in Miss Marple. The brass key unlocked the top drawer of the morning room desk, revealing a collection of documents that cast yesterday's wedding in an entirely different light. The papers detailed Captain Ashford's financial situation with uncomfortable clarity. Gambling debts, loans at extortionate interest rates, and a proposed marriage settlement that would have bound Sylvia's trust fund to her husband's obligations in a manner that could only be described as predatory. Mrs. Hartwell had discovered these documents by accident and felt compelled to warn her daughter before any signatures were obtained. "I could not allow Sylvia to sign away her security without understanding what it meant," Mrs. Hartwell explained, her voice tight with suppressed emotion. "Daniel may be a charming man, but his financial difficulties are severe. The settlement his solicitor proposed would have made Sylvia responsible for debts she knew nothing about." Miss Marple studied the documents with interest, noting not only their contents, but also the circumstances of their discovery. "These were to be signed this morning?" "Yes." Daniel's solicitor insisted on expedition, claiming it was merely a formality. But formalities in legal matters are rarely as innocent as they appear. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Mr. Hartwell, who entered the morning room with the particular stiffness of a man under considerable stress. His reaction to finding Miss Marple examining the financial documents was immediate and defensive. "I see we are airing our private business before the entire village," he said sharply, though he made an effort to moderate his tone when addressing Miss Marple directly. "These are family matters, not subjects for general discussion." Miss Marple's observant eye noted several details that struck her as significant. Mr. Hartwell's dark coat bore traces of white powder on the cuff. Sugar, most likely, though from what source was unclear. His manner suggested a man who had spent the night making difficult decisions, and his obvious discomfort with the financial documents being exposed indicated that the family's situation was more complex than it appeared. The arrival of Inspector Slack provided a welcome interruption to what was becoming an increasingly tense family discussion. The inspector's interview with the family was conducted with his usual combination of officiousness and superficiality. But Miss Marple was pleased to note that Dr. Haydock had apparently impressed upon him the seriousness of the medical evidence. During the questioning, several important details emerged. The wedding favors, small packets of sugared almonds tied with ribbons, had been prepared by Mrs. Hartwell and Sylvia the previous afternoon. They had been placed on a silver tray in the vestry before the ceremony, where they were distributed during the signing of the register. Most significantly, the verger recalled that one packet had been tied with a white ribbon instead of blue, a detail that had caught his attention because of its uniqueness. Dr. Haydock's quiet observation that Major Wickham had specifically chosen the white-ribboned packet added another layer of significance to this detail. In Miss Marple's experience, when someone always chose what appeared different or special, it suggested either a particular personality trait or, more ominously, that someone else was counting on that predictable behavior. As the official interview concluded, Miss Marple found herself piecing together a pattern that was both disturbing and illuminating. Major Wickham had died after consuming a wedding favor that had been deliberately made distinctive. The financial documents revealed motives that extended beyond simple personal animosity. And the various suspicious behaviors she had observed suggested that several people had been operating under considerable pressure yesterday. The mystery was deepening rather than clarifying. But Miss Marple had learned long ago that truth often emerged not from the obvious explanations that satisfied officials like Inspector Slack, but from the small inconsistencies and human behaviors that revealed the real motivations behind seemingly inexplicable events. As she made her way home through the village streets, she reflected that while yesterday's wedding had ended in tragedy, the investigation into that tragedy was only just beginning to reveal the complex web of relationships and secrets that had made murder not only possible, but perhaps inevitable. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Little Furlong, and in those shadows, Miss Marple knew, lay the answers she was determined to find. The following morning brought confirmation of Dr. Haydock's quietly voiced suspicions, though the news arrived with the measured pace typical of official proceedings in Little Furlong. Miss Marple was arranging her breakfast china when she observed the doctor's motor car making its second journey to the police station, followed by the arrival of additional officials whose grave expressions suggested that Inspector Slack's comfortable theory of natural causes had been definitively abandoned. By mid-morning, the transformation of yesterday's tragedy into something far more sinister had become official knowledge, though the details emerged gradually through the village's intricate network of domestic connections. Mrs. Bantry, whose cook's sister worked at the police station, was among the first to learn that Major Wickham had indeed died from poison, a substance that had acted with swift and terrible efficiency. The most disturbing aspect, Mrs. Bantry confided when she called upon Miss Marple with this intelligence, is that it was definitely in that white-ribboned wedding favor. Dr. Haydock was quite certain about it. Someone deliberately prepared that packet, knowing Major Wickham would choose it. Miss Marple received this information with the calm attention she accorded all significant revelations, though inwardly she noted how this confirmation aligned with several observations she had been contemplating. "It does suggest someone with intimate knowledge of the gentleman's habits," she agreed mildly. The official investigation now focused with renewed intensity upon the wedding party, and Inspector Slack's attention had settled, perhaps predictably, upon Captain Ashford. The financial documents that Miss Marple had examined in the Hartwell morning room were no longer a private family concern, but evidence in a murder inquiry. The narrative appeared straightforward to the inspector's methodical mind. A desperate bridegroom, faced with exposure of his deceptive marriage settlement by his best man, had eliminated the threat with calculated precision. Miss Marple observed Captain Ashford during his formal questioning at the police station, noting his genuine distress at both the loss of his friend and the uncomfortable scrutiny of his financial affairs. His grief seemed authentic rather than performed, though she was well aware that human nature could produce convincing displays when circumstances demanded them. The captain vehemently denied any knowledge of poison or motive for harming Major Wickham, insisting that his friend had been his most trusted confidant. "Why would I harm Mark?" Captain Ashford had exclaimed, his voice carrying the particular strain of someone whose world had suddenly become inexplicable. "He was my support, my closest friend. These financial complications, they're embarrassing, certainly, but hardly worth murder." Inspector Slack, however, remained focused on the practical evidence. The white-ribboned packet had been distinctive, deliberately so, and Major Wickham's selection of it suggested someone had counted on his predictable behavior. The verger's testimony that the Major had specifically chosen the different packet, combined with Captain Ashford's own comment about his friend always choosing the odd one out, created a circumstantial case that satisfied the inspector's preference for straightforward solutions. Yet Miss Marple found herself troubled by certain aspects of this theory. If Captain Ashford had intended to poison his best man, would he have drawn attention to the specific packet by commenting upon it? The remarks suggested either remarkable audacity or, perhaps more likely, genuine surprise at his friend's choice. Human psychology, in her experience, was rarely as simple as official investigations preferred to assume. Seeking to clarify her own observations, Miss Marple made her way to St. Bartholomew's, where the Reverend Clement was attempting to restore some semblance of normalcy to his violated sanctuary. The vestry, though cleared by the police, still bore subtle traces of yesterday's tragedy. A faint medicinal odor lingering in the air, a slight disarray in the usual careful arrangement of ceremonial items. "Such a violation of sacred space," the Reverend murmured as he welcomed Miss Marple's visit. "To think that someone planned murder in God's house during one of our most joyous ceremonies." Miss Marple offered appropriate sympathy while allowing her observant gaze to catalogue the scene. The silver salver that had held the wedding favors remained on the vestry table, and she noted with interest that someone had cleaned it thoroughly, perhaps too thoroughly, given that it now gleamed with a brightness that seemed inconsistent with its usual patina. More significantly, she observed that one of the empty gauze packets, overlooked in the official examination, bore a tiny puncture mark that could have been made by a fine needle. "Reverend," she inquired gently, "when Mrs. Hartwell prepared the wedding favors, did she mention any particular care in their arrangement?" The clergyman considered this carefully. "She was most meticulous, I recall. Each packet tied with identical precision, save for that final one where they had run short of blue ribbon. She mentioned hoping no one would notice the substitution." This detail struck Miss Marple as significant. If the white ribbon had been a last-minute substitution due to running short of blue, it suggested the poisoner had either been remarkably fortunate in their timing or had deliberately created the shortage to ensure a distinctive packet would be available. Her investigation was interrupted by an unexpected encounter with Sylvia Ashford, who appeared at the church door with the hesitant manner of someone seeking sanctuary from overwhelming circumstances. The young woman looked fragile in her mourning dress, her usual composure replaced by an air of bewildered grief. "Miss Marple," Sylvia began quietly, "I've been thinking about yesterday. Trying to remember every detail. The police keep asking the same questions, but I feel as though I'm missing something important." Miss Marple encouraged her to share whatever recollections troubled her, and Sylvia's account proved illuminating. She remembered that Major Wickham had arrived at the church unusually early, claiming he wanted to ensure proper arrangements, but spending considerable time examining the vestry preparations with what seemed like suspicious attention. He was particularly interested in the wedding favors, Sylvia recalled. He asked Mother detailed questions about who had prepared them, when they were made, whether anyone else had handled them. At the time, I thought he was simply being thorough, but now it seems rather odd behavior for a best man. More significantly, Sylvia revealed that during the confusion following Major Wickham's collapse, she had noticed that a second wedding favor had disappeared from the silver tray. Not just the poisoned white-ribboned packet, but another with a blue ribbon that had been placed beside it. Mother had arranged them in a specific pattern, Sylvia explained. The gap was quite noticeable once I thought to look for it. Someone must have taken it during the commotion. This detail suggested that the murderer had been concerned about more than just the poison packet. Perhaps the missing favor contained fingerprints or traces of the poison used in preparation, or some other evidence that could identify the killer. As evening approached and the village settled into an uneasy routine, Miss Marple reflected on the various threads that were beginning to weave themselves into a pattern. The financial motive was clear, but perhaps too obvious. The method required intimate knowledge of Major Wickham's habits and access to the wedding preparations. Most intriguingly, the missing second packet suggested someone with enough presence of mind to remove evidence even in the midst of apparent shock and confusion. The investigation was revealing not just the mechanics of murder, but the complex web of relationships and secrets that made such a crime possible. In Miss Marple's experience, the most important revelations often came not from official inquiries, but from the small, unguarded moments when people revealed their true natures under pressure. Tomorrow would bring further developments, but tonight, as she sat with her knitting by the window overlooking the village green, Miss Marple knew that somewhere among the wedding guests and family members was someone who had planned and executed murder with chilling calculation. The truth was there, hidden among the sugared almonds and financial documents, waiting for the right moment and the right question to bring it into the light. The bells of St. Bartholomew's remained silent now, their joyous proclamation replaced by the somber reality that even in Little Furlong, the most sacred occasions could conceal the darkest human impulses. The coroner's inquest convened in the village hall with the particular solemnity that Little Furlong reserved for its most serious occasions. Miss Marple took her customary position near the back, her knitting bag resting quietly beside her as the formal proceedings began to unravel the official version of Major Wickham's death. The coroner, a precise gentleman with steel-rimmed spectacles, conducted the inquiry with methodical thoroughness that left little room for speculation, though Miss Marple noted how each witness's testimony revealed as much about the speaker as about the events they described. Dr. Haydock's medical evidence was presented with clinical clarity. The post-mortem had confirmed the presence of a powerful alkaloid poison, administered in sufficient quantity to cause rapid cardiac failure. The symptoms he had observed, the facial discoloration, the suddenness of collapse, the particular odor he had detected, all pointed to a substance that acted with terrible efficiency. Most significantly, the poison had been concentrated in the wedding favor, bearing the distinctive white ribbon, leaving no doubt that the method of delivery had been both deliberate and precisely calculated. The Reverend Clement's testimony established the sequence of events within the vestry with the accuracy of a man accustomed to ritual. The register had been prepared, the signatures obtained from bride and groom, and the silver tray of wedding favors offered as a pleasant tradition while the final paperwork was completed. He recalled Major Wickham's cheerful comment about people making strange choices, delivered just moments before the gentleman selected the white-ribboned packet with what the Reverend described as a little flourish of satisfaction. The verger's evidence proved particularly illuminating, though Miss Marple suspected its full significance escaped Inspector Slack's attention. The man described his careful preparation of the vestry, his brief absence to fetch a proper pen nib from the choir vestry, and his return to find everything apparently as he had left it. However, under gentle questioning from the coroner, he revealed a detail that caught Miss Marple's interest. The vestry key had not been on its proper peg when he arrived that morning, but rather sitting on the window-sill, displaced from its usual position. Most irregular, the verger explained with obvious distress. I keep things in their proper places. The key belongs on the peg, always has done. Found it quite by accident when I went to polish the brass. Inspector Slack dismissed this as a minor housekeeping matter, but Miss Marple filed the information away with the particular attention she reserved for details that disturbed established routines. In her experience, small disruptions in familiar patterns often indicated larger disturbances in human behavior. Mrs. Hartwell's testimony was delivered with admirable composure, describing the preparation of the wedding favors with Sylvia the previous afternoon. She explained the substitution of white ribbon for blue when their supply ran short, a detail that seemed innocent enough until one considered how it had made Major Wickham's fatal choice both distinctive and predictable. Her voice remained steady throughout, though Miss Marple noted the slight tightening of her gloved hands when question turned to the timing of the favor's placement in the vestry. Captain Ashford's statement was brief and dignified, his grief evident despite his efforts at military composure. He confirmed his friend's habit of choosing the unusual or distinctive option in any array, describing it as a boyish trait that Mark never outgrew. The affection in his voice seemed genuine, making his alleged motive for murder appear increasingly implausible to anyone not already convinced of his guilt. Following the inquest's adjournment, pending the coroner's final report, Miss Marple began her own careful investigation into the circumstances surrounding Major Wickham's final day. Her first stop was the King's Arms, where she learned from the proprietress that the Major had been particular about his breakfast arrangements, insisting on preparing his own tea from a personal tin and showing unusual concern about the quality of the local water. Seemed rather fussy for a gentleman of his background, Mrs. Jameson confided. Military men are usually less particular about such domestic details, but he was quite insistent about controlling his own refreshments. This behavior suggested either extraordinary fastidiousness or, more troubling, a man who had reason to be cautious about what he consumed. Miss Marple found herself wondering whether Major Wickham had been aware of some threat to his safety, perhaps explaining his careful attention to the vestry arrangements that several witnesses had noted. Her investigation led her next to St. Bartholomew's, where she made a discovery that cast new light on the verger's testimony about the displaced key. A careful examination of the key peg revealed traces of white powder caught in the wood grain. Not dust or chalk, but something finer and more deliberately applied. Sugar, perhaps, or the residue of someone handling confections with insufficiently clean hands. More significantly, she noticed scuff marks on the stone floor near the vestry entrance, irregular scratches that suggested something heavy had been dragged or hastily repositioned during a time when normal care was not being exercised. The marks were fresh, inconsistent with the usual careful maintenance of the sacred space. At the Hartwell residence, Miss Marple observed the family dynamics with the particular attention she devoted to human behavior under stress. Mr. Hartwell's manner had grown increasingly brittle since the wedding day, his usual professional composure replaced by barely controlled agitation. She noted the white powder residue on his coat cuff, too fine for flour, too persistent for chalk, and his obvious discomfort when the financial documents were mentioned in conversation. Mrs. Hartwell maintained her dignified facade, but Miss Marple detected subtle signs of strain in her careful monitoring of her husband's reactions and her protective positioning near Sylvia during difficult conversations. The mother's behavior suggested someone guarding secrets that extended beyond the immediate tragedy. Sylvia herself remained a source of particular interest. Her grief seemed genuine but complicated, as if she were struggling with knowledge that made her husband's predicament even more painful. During a quiet moment in the vicarage garden, she confided her growing certainty of Daniel's innocence, but her reasons went beyond wifely loyalty. Mark spent considerable time with father in recent weeks, she revealed. They had long conversations in the study, often quite heated discussions about matters they never explained to mother or me. I began to wonder if Mark had discovered something troubling about our family's affairs. This information aligned with Miss Marple's growing suspicion that Major Wickham's death was connected to knowledge he had acquired rather than simple financial motives. The gentleman's careful behavior on his final morning, combined with his obvious investigation of the vestry arrangements, suggested someone who had been gathering evidence rather than simply preparing for a social occasion. The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor to Miss Marple's cottage in the form of Mr. Albright, the solicitor whose pressure for signatures had been noted during the family's distress. His manner was professionally correct, but carried an undercurrent of urgency that seemed disproportionate to normal legal procedures. "Miss Marple," he began with careful courtesy, "I understand you have taken an interest in the unfortunate events surrounding the Hartwell-Ashford wedding. As the family's legal representative, I feel compelled to mention that premature speculation about these matters could prove quite damaging to innocent parties." His warning, delivered with legal precision, struck Miss Marple as the behavior of a man more concerned with protecting secrets than seeking justice. She responded with her customary mildness, while noting his obvious anxiety about the investigation's direction. As evening approached, Miss Marple reflected on the various threads of evidence she had gathered. The displaced vestry key suggested someone had gained unauthorized access to prepare the murder scene. The sugar residue and scuff marks indicated hasty activity by someone under considerable stress. Major Wickham's cautious behavior suggested he had been investigating something that made him fear for his safety. Most significantly, the pressure from Mr. Albright and the heated discussions between Major Wickham's and Mr. Hartwell pointed to legal or financial complications that extended beyond Captain Ashford's admitted difficulties. The wedding had provided perfect cover for a crime whose real motives lay hidden in the complex web of professional relationships and family secrets that characterized village life. Tomorrow would bring further revelations, but tonight, as she sat with her knitting and watched the lights in the various houses around the village green, Miss Marple knew that the truth was beginning to emerge. From the careful observation of human nature under pressure. Someone had planned Major Wickham's death with meticulous attention to detail, but human behavior, even under the most careful control, always revealed the patterns that led to exposure and justice. The bells of St. Bartholomew's remained silent in the gathering darkness, but Miss Marple could almost hear them preparing to ring out the truth when the proper moment arrived. The night brought more than restless sleep to Little Furlong. Miss Marple, whose bedroom window afforded an excellent view of the village's nocturnal activities, observed a motor car proceeding down the lane with unusual stealth, its lamps dimmed and its progress deliberately quiet. Such furtive behavior in a village where everyone knew everyone else's business invariably indicated activities that would not bear scrutiny in daylight. Her observations proved prescient when the Reverend Clement appeared at her door shortly after breakfast, his usual composure replaced by indignation and bewilderment. The vicarage safe had been tampered with during the night, not successfully breached thanks to the Reverend's unfortunate habit of keeping the combination written in his prayer book rather than committing it to memory, but showing clear evidence of determined effort. "The study window was forced," he explained, his voice tight with outrage. "Deep scratches around the safe, papers scattered, and the strangest thing, whoever did it seemed to know exactly what they were looking for. They ignored the offertory entirely and went straight for the private papers Mrs. Hartwell entrusted to me yesterday evening." Miss Marple received this information with the calm attention she accorded all significant developments, though inwardly she noted how desperation had a way of advertising itself through hasty actions and careless evidence. The timing of the attempted burglary, so soon after Mrs. Hartwell's prudent decision to secure important documents, suggested someone was growing increasingly anxious about what those papers might reveal. Her morning visit to the village shop provided additional intelligence through the efficient gossip network that connected every household in Little Furlong. Mrs. Lumley had observed Mr. Hartwell's motor car returning to his residence at an unusually late hour, and Mr. Davies the postman reported seeing lights burning in the Hartwell study well past midnight. Such nocturnal activity from a man known for his punctual habits indicated considerable agitation about urgent matters. More significantly, Miss Marple learned from her careful inquiries that Major Wickham had not been in Little Furlong merely as Captain Ashford's best man. Mr. Albright, the solicitor, had been asking discreet questions about the Major's business in the village, and his obvious anxiety suggested professional concerns that extended beyond simple social obligations. The truth emerged gradually through Miss Marple's patient investigation. Major Wickham had been engaged by distant relatives of Mrs. Hartwell's family to examine the administration of a substantial trust fund that had been under Mr. Hartwell's management for several years. Recent attempts to restructure the trust in ways that would significantly benefit Mr. Hartwell had raised suspicions among the beneficiaries, leading to Major Wickham's discreet inquiry into the fund's management. This revelation transformed Miss Marple's understanding of the crime entirely. The heated discussions between Major Wickham and Mr. Hartwell that Sylvia had observed were not casual conversations but professional interrogations. Major Wickham's careful behavior on his final morning, his attention to the vestry arrangements, and his obvious wariness about what he consumed all indicated a man who knew he was in danger from someone desperate to prevent exposure. Dr. Haydock's contribution to this emerging picture proved crucial when he shared his discovery of a blue silk fiber beneath Major Wickham's fingernail, not from the white ribbon that had adorned the fatal wedding favor, but from the blue ribbons used on the other packets. This suggested a struggle or at least contact with someone handling the blue-ribboned favors, possibly during their preparation or placement. Miss Marple's visit to the Hartwell residence confirmed her growing suspicions about the family's involvement. She found Mrs. Hartwell in the garden, attempting to tend her roses with obvious distraction. The usually meticulous gardener was making poor work of her pruning, her movements betraying the agitation she was trying to conceal. "Such delicate work, gardening," Miss Marple observed gently, noting the patch of monkshood growing near the kitchen door. "One must be so careful with the more dangerous plants. Aconite, for instance, beautiful but deadly if mishandled." Mrs. Hartwell's reaction was immediate and telling. Her face went pale, and she nearly dropped her pruning shears. "Indeed," she whispered, "Edward has always been fascinated by botanical specimens. He knows a great deal about their properties." The conversation that followed revealed the full scope of the tragedy. Mrs. Hartwell had gradually become aware of her husband's mismanagement of her family trust, though she had not understood the extent of his desperation until Major Wickham's investigation threatened to expose everything. The financial documents she had hidden in the vicarage safe detailed systematic embezzlement spanning several years, conducted through careful manipulation of investment records and falsified accounting. "Edward felt cornered," Mrs. Hartwell explained, her voice barely audible. "The trust was my inheritance, you see. He believed he had the right to manage it as he saw fit, but his investments went badly wrong. He borrowed against the principal, then borrowed more to cover the losses. When Major Wickham began asking questions about the recent restructuring proposals, Edward realized his situation was hopeless. The method of murder became clear through Miss Marple's careful reconstruction of events. Mr. Hartwell had access to the vestry key through his position as churchwarden. His wife's innocent preparation of wedding favors had provided the perfect delivery system, and his knowledge of Major Wickham's habits, gained through their recent confrontations, had allowed him to ensure the fatal packet would be selected. The white ribbon substitution had been a desperate improvisation when the original plan required a distinctive marker. Mr. Hartwell had purchased white ribbon from the village shop, replaced one blue ribbon with white while his wife was distracted, and added aconite extract from his garden to the sugared almonds. The sugar residue Miss Marple had observed on the key peg and around the vestry came from his nervous handling of the sweets during their preparation. Most tellingly, Mrs. Hartwell revealed that her husband had returned home on the wedding morning with traces of blue silk thread on his clothing, evidence of his hasty removal of the second wedding favor to eliminate potential evidence of his tampering. "He was trying to protect me," Mrs. Hartwell said with heartbreaking loyalty. "The scandal of the embezzlement would have ruined us both, but I never imagined he would resort to such desperate measures." As Miss Marple prepared to share her conclusions with the authorities, she reflected on the tragic irony of the situation. A wedding that should have celebrated new beginnings had become the setting for murder, and a family celebration had provided cover for a crime rooted in financial desperation and misplaced pride. The trust fund that should have secured Mrs. Hartwell's future had instead become the motive for destroying it entirely. The investigation had revealed not just the mechanics of murder, but the complex web of family loyalty, financial pressure, and moral compromise that made such a crime possible. In Miss Marple's experience, the most dangerous criminals were often not the obviously wicked, but the apparently respectable individuals who convinced themselves that desperate circumstances justified terrible actions. The bells of St. Bartholomew's remained silent as the village prepared for another kind of reckoning. one that would expose the careful facade of respectability that had concealed systematic theft and calculated murder. The wedding day secret was finally emerging into the light, though the cost in human suffering would be considerable for all involved. Tomorrow would bring formal accusations and legal proceedings, but tonight Miss Marple sat with her knitting and reflected on the eternal truth that in villages, as in all human communities, the most ordinary people were capable of both the greatest kindness and the most terrible crimes when circumstances pushed them beyond the boundaries of civilized behavior. The morning following Mrs. Hartwell's devastating revelations brought an atmosphere of tense expectation to Little Furlong, as if the village itself were holding its breath while waiting for the inevitable conclusion to unfold. Miss Marple, having spent a restless night contemplating the various threads of evidence, found herself drawn once again to her garden, where the routine of tending roses provided a peaceful counterpoint to the disturbing complexities of human nature she had been observing. Her quiet morning was interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Slack, whose manner suggested a man grappling with the uncomfortable realization that his investigation had taken a direction he had neither anticipated nor entirely welcomed. The inspector's previous confidence in straightforward solutions had been thoroughly undermined by the accumulating evidence against Mr. Hartwell, and his request for Miss Marple's continued assistance carried the reluctant acknowledgement that village wisdom might prove more valuable than official procedures. "Miss Marple," he began with uncharacteristic deference, "I've been reviewing the evidence we've gathered, and I find myself concerned about certain aspects of this case. Dr. Haydock's analysis of the poison, combined with your observations about Mr. Hartwell's access and opportunity, certainly builds a compelling case, yet something troubles me about the overall pattern." Miss Marple received this confidence with her customary calm attention, though she had been harboring similar concerns throughout her own nocturnal reflections. The case against Mr. Hartwell was indeed compelling, perhaps too compelling for a man whose criminal experience had been limited to financial manipulation conducted from the safety of his professional office. Their discussion was interrupted by an unexpected development that would prove to alter the investigation's trajectory significantly. Dr. Haydock arrived with the news that cast the previous day's revelations in an entirely different light. His continued analysis of the wedding favors had revealed a disturbing pattern that suggested the crime was far more complex than anyone had initially suspected. "I've examined every remaining packet," Dr. Haydock reported, his professional composure unable to entirely mask his obvious distress. The poison was not limited to the white-ribboned favor that killed Major Wickham. 3 additional packets contained traces of aconite, though in lower concentrations. The distribution pattern suggests either remarkable carelessness or deliberate intent to harm multiple guests. This revelation struck Miss Marple with particular force, as it contradicted her carefully constructed understanding of Mr. Hartwell's character and motivations. While she could envision the solicitor resorting to murder under extreme pressure, the idea of him risking the lives of innocent wedding guests seemed fundamentally incompatible with the man she had observed over years of village life. Inspector Slack's response was immediate and practical. "Multiple poisoned packets suggests either a madman or someone with motives that extend beyond simply eliminating Major Wickham. We need to reconsider our assumptions about both the perpetrator and the intended victims." The implications of this discovery became clearer when Miss Marple learned from the Reverend Clement that the papers Mrs. Hartwell had entrusted to the vicarage safe contained more than evidence of embezzlement. Among the documents were correspondence with London financial associates whose activities, according to the careful phrasing of a man uncomfortable with worldly matters, appeared to extend well beyond legitimate investment management. "Mrs. Hartwell seemed genuinely frightened when she brought those papers to me," the Reverend confided during his visit to Miss Marple's cottage. "She spoke of feeling threatened not just by financial exposure, but by people who might resort to violence to protect their interests. I fear we may be dealing with influences that extend far beyond our peaceful village boundaries." This information transformed Miss Marple's understanding of the crime entirely. If Mr. Hartwell had become involved with criminal associates through his management of the trust fund, then Major Wickham's investigation threatened not just local reputation, but organized criminal activities. The multiple poisoned wedding favors might have been intended to create sufficient chaos and tragedy to discourage further inquiry into the trust's administration. Her growing concern about the case's complexity was heightened by an observation she made during her afternoon visit to the village shop. Mr. Albright, the solicitor whose pressure for quick signatures had been noted by the family, was engaged in urgent conversation with a gentleman she did not recognize. A well-dressed individual whose manner suggested London origins and professional concerns that extended beyond provincial legal matters. Their discussion, conducted in the privacy of the shop's back room, was too quiet to overhear directly, but Miss Marple's practiced eye noted several telling details. The stranger's expensive clothing and confident bearing suggested someone accustomed to wielding considerable influence. Mr. Albright's obvious deference and barely concealed anxiety indicated that their relationship was not one of equals. Most significantly, she observed the stranger's casual handling of what appeared to be a substantial sum of money, suggesting that financial arrangements were being concluded with unusual urgency. The afternoon brought another development that further complicated the investigation. Sylvia Ashford, pale with exhaustion and barely maintaining her composure, sought out Miss Marple with fragments of information that painted a terrifying picture of coercion and manipulation. Her mother's sedated ravings had included references to threats against the family and pressure from her husband's London associates to ensure that Major Wickham's investigation was terminated permanently. Mother kept saying that father never intended for anyone else to be hurt, Sylvia whispered, her voice shaking with fear and confusion. She spoke of men who had invested money through father's management of the trust, money that came from activities she wouldn't specify. They couldn't allow their involvement to be exposed, and they made it clear that our entire family would suffer if Major Wickham continued his inquiry. The implications were staggering. The wedding day murder had been orchestrated not by a desperate provincial solicitor acting alone, but by criminal associates who viewed the elimination of Major Wickham as a necessary business expense. Mr. Hartwell's role appeared to be that of an unwilling accomplice, coerced into providing access and local knowledge, while others determined the method and scope of the crime. This explained the multiple poisoned wedding favors. Not the work of a man trying to protect his reputation, but the calculated brutality of criminals who viewed innocent guests as acceptable casualties if their deaths would complicate the investigation and discourage further inquiry into the trust's administration. As evening approached, Miss Marple found herself confronting a case that had evolved far beyond the domestic tragedy she had initially suspected. The financial documents hidden in the vicarage safe revealed not just embezzlement, but systematic money laundering conducted through the respectable facade of trust fund management. Major Wickham's investigation had threatened to expose criminal activities worth considerable sums, making his elimination not just desirable, but essential from the perspective of his killers. The wedding day secret involved not just local financial impropriety, but organized criminal activity that extended into London's shadowy financial districts. The peaceful village of Little Furlong had become the setting for a crime whose ramifications extended far beyond its ancient boundaries, and the investigation was entering its most dangerous phase. Miss Marple knew that such stakes inevitably led to further violence, and that the wedding day murder might prove to be only the beginning of a campaign to silence anyone who threatened to expose the complex web of corruption that had made such a crime both possible and necessary. The truth was emerging, but with it came the realization that some secrets were protected by forces far more dangerous than village gossip and social embarrassment. The bells of St. Bartholomew's remained silent in the gathering darkness, but Miss Marple could sense the approaching storm that would test not just her investigative abilities, but the safety of everyone who had become entangled in the deadly secrets that had transformed a joyous celebration into a scene of calculated murder. The investigation was far from over, and the most dangerous revelations were yet to come. The revelation about multiple poisoned wedding favors cast a pall over Little Furlong that seemed to seep into every conversation and shadow every interaction. Miss Marple, observing the village's response from her morning position in the garden, noted how fear had a way of revealing character more clearly than comfort ever could. Some villagers drew together in mutual support, while others retreated into suspicious isolation, and a few seemed almost energized by the drama unfolding in their midst. Dr. Haydock's motorcar had been making frequent journeys between the police station and his surgery, and when Miss Marple encountered him outside the village shop, his expression carried the weight of a man grappling with evidence that challenged his understanding of human nature. His quiet revelation proved both illuminating and disturbing. "I've completed the analysis of all remaining wedding favors," he confided, his voice carefully modulated to avoid attracting unwanted attention. "The pattern is more complex than we initially suspected. 3 additional packets contained aconite, but in varying concentrations. The white-ribboned favor that killed Major Wickham contained a lethal dose, while the others held amounts calculated to cause illness, but not death." Miss Marple received this information with her customary calm attention, though her mind immediately began cataloguing the implications. "Almost as if someone were conducting an experiment," she observed mildly. "Precisely my thought," Dr. Haydock agreed. "But the most disturbing aspect is the precision involved. This wasn't the work of someone acting in panic or desperation. The concentrations were carefully calculated by someone with considerable knowledge of toxicology." This professional assessment aligned with Miss Marple's growing conviction that the crime involved individuals far more sophisticated than the village tragedy had initially suggested. The careful gradation of poison doses indicated not just murderous intent, but systematic planning that extended beyond the simple elimination of Major Wickham. Her investigation took an unexpected turn when she discovered that the Reverend Clement had received an unusual visitor during the early morning hours. A gentleman claiming to represent insurance interests had arrived at the vicarage with detailed questions about the church's security arrangements and the storage of valuable documents. The Reverend's description of this individual, well-dressed, professionally courteous, but displaying knowledge that seemed inconsistent with legitimate insurance purposes, suggested surveillance rather than routine business. He was particularly interested in the safe, the Reverend explained with obvious discomfort. Asked detailed questions about who had access, when documents were typically deposited or retrieved, and whether we maintained records of such transactions. When I mentioned that certain papers had been entrusted to me recently, his attention became quite focused. Miss Marple found this intelligence deeply troubling. The attempted burglary of the vicarage, followed by professional inquiries about document security, indicated that someone was conducting a systematic assessment of what evidence might threaten their interests. Such methodical approach suggested resources and experience that extended far beyond village boundaries. The afternoon brought a development that dramatically altered the investigation's trajectory. Mrs. Hartwell, pale with exhaustion and barely maintaining her composure, sought out Miss Marple with information that cast the entire case in a new and terrifying light. Her husband's condition had deteriorated during the night, and in his delirium, he had revealed details about his London associates that painted a picture of systematic criminal enterprise. Edward spoke of threats against Sylvia, Mrs. Hartwell whispered, her voice trembling with fear and exhaustion. Men who had invested money through his management of the trust, money from activities he wouldn't specify. They made it clear that our entire family would suffer if Major Wickham's investigation continued. The implications were staggering. The wedding day murder had been orchestrated not by desperate local individuals, but by criminal associates who viewed the elimination of Major Wickham as a necessary business expense. The multiple poisoned favors represented not carelessness, but calculated brutality designed to create confusion while eliminating a specific threat. Miss Marple's understanding of the crime deepened when she made a careful examination of the physical evidence that had been overlooked in the initial investigation. The blue silk fiber found beneath Major Wickham's fingernail, combined with her observation of the wedding favor preparation, suggested a struggle or at least significant contact during the final moments. More significantly, she noticed that one of the remaining blue-ribboned packets showed signs of having been opened and resealed. The ribbon bore tiny creases that indicated it had been untied and retied with less care than Mrs. Hartwell's meticulous original work. The pattern of evidence pointed to someone with intimate knowledge of the wedding preparations who had gained access to the favors after their initial preparation but before the ceremony. This individual had possessed both the toxicological knowledge to prepare graduated poison doses and the cold calculation to risk innocent lives in service of their larger criminal enterprise. Her investigation was interrupted by an encounter that confirmed her worst suspicions about the scope of the conspiracy. Captain Ashford arrived at her cottage in a state of considerable agitation, bearing intelligence that connected the current crisis to events far beyond Little Furlong's peaceful boundaries. "Miss Marple," he began, his military composure finally cracking under the strain, "I've remembered something that Mark mentioned weeks ago. He was investigating financial irregularities involving a man named Henderson, someone we both knew from our Indian service. Mark believed Henderson had established a network for processing money from questionable sources through respectable provincial solicitors. This revelation provided the missing link Miss Marple had been seeking. Major Wickham's investigation had threatened not just local embezzlement, but a sophisticated money laundering operation that used trust fund management as cover for criminal financial activities. The stakes were enormous, making his elimination not just desirable, but essential from the perspective of his killers. The criminal network's professional approach became evident when Miss Marple learned that Mr. Albright had received a second visitor, a gentleman who had arrived with legal documents requiring immediate signatures and departure from Little Furlong. The solicitor's obvious distress, combined with his hasty preparations for travel, suggested that the criminal associates were systematically eliminating potential witnesses and evidence. As evening approached, Miss Marple found herself confronting the most dangerous phase of any investigation, the moment when accumulated evidence threatened to expose criminal activities worth enormous sums. The wedding day murder had been committed by individuals who viewed killing as routine business practice, and they possessed both the resources and the ruthlessness to eliminate anyone who threatened their enterprise. Yet she had also observed something that gave her hope for exposing the truth. Human nature, even under the most careful control, invariably revealed patterns that led to identification. The killer's meticulous preparation had left traces, not in obvious evidence that could be destroyed, but in the subtle behavioral patterns that betrayed character and habit. The multiple poisoned wedding favors had been intended to create confusion and eliminate specific threats, but they had also revealed the methodical mind behind the crime. Someone with access to the wedding preparations, knowledge of toxicology, and the cold calculation to risk innocent lives had orchestrated Major Wickham's death. That someone was still among them, still dangerous, but no longer invisible to eyes trained to observe the revealing details of human behavior under pressure. Miss Marple knew that the final confrontation was approaching, and that the truth would emerge not from dramatic revelations, but from the careful observation of how people responded when their carefully constructed deceptions began to unravel. The wedding day's secret was about to be exposed, though the cost in human suffering would be considerable for all involved. The bells of St. Bartholomew's remained silent in the gathering darkness, but Miss Marple could sense that justice was preparing to ring out across Little Furlong, bringing both resolution and reckoning to those who had thought themselves beyond the reach of village wisdom and divine justice. The morning brought Little Furlong a peculiar quality of light, filtered through mist that seemed to muffle not just sound, but the very certainty that had once characterized village life. Miss Marple, observing from her kitchen window as she prepared her morning tea, noted how the weather had driven people to cluster in doorways and shop entrances, their conversations conducted in the hushed tones reserved for matters too serious for ordinary discussion. The change everyone had been anticipating arrived with Dr. Haydock's motor car proceeding toward the police station with unusual urgency. When Inspector Slack emerged an hour later, his expression carried the weight of a man who had received news that transformed his understanding of the case entirely. The intelligence he shared with Miss Marple confirmed her growing suspicions about the true scope of the criminal enterprise they were confronting. Mr. Albright had been found dead in his office, collapsed at his desk with the telltale signs of aconite poisoning that had become grimly familiar to Little Furlong. Near his hand lay a blue-ribboned wedding favor, its gauze packet bearing the distinctive signs of having been opened and resealed with less care than Mrs. Hartwell's meticulous original work. The solicitor's death eliminated a crucial link in the criminal chain, but it also provided Miss Marple with the final piece of evidence she had been seeking. "The ribbon work is most instructive," she observed to Dr. Haydock as they examined the scene under Inspector Slack's supervision. Mrs. Hartwell's bows were uniform in their prettiness, symmetrical loops tied with a housewife's attention to appearance. This bow has been retied by someone who ties for security rather than charm. The knot lies flat and holds fast, but the aesthetic consideration is entirely absent. Dr. Haydock nodded grimly. The same aconite preparation, administered in tea. Whoever delivered this knew exactly what concentration would prove fatal and how quickly it would act. The implications were staggering. Someone with intimate knowledge of both the wedding favor preparation and advanced toxicological expertise had been systematically eliminating potential witnesses. The criminal network's reach extended not just to intimidation and bribery, but to professional assassination conducted with medical precision. Miss Marple's investigation into the physical evidence revealed details that painted a disturbing picture of calculated murder. The blue silk fiber found beneath Major Wickham's fingernail matched the ribbon used on the wedding favors, but microscopic examination revealed it had been handled by someone wearing leather gloves, not the bare hands that would be expected during normal preparation. More significantly, chemical analysis of the resealed packet found near Albright showed traces of camphor and medicinal compounds that indicated storage in a professional medical environment. The pattern of evidence pointed inexorably towards someone with both medical knowledge and access to the wedding preparations. Someone who could move freely within village society while maintaining connections that extended far beyond Little Furlong's peaceful boundaries. Someone who possessed the professional expertise to create graduated poison concentrations and the cold calculation to risk innocent lives in service of larger criminal objectives. Her growing certainty about the killer's identity was confirmed when she made a careful examination of the wedding favor evidence that Dr. Haydock had preserved. The distinctive knotwork on the resealed packet bore the characteristics of someone trained in precise, functional tying. Not the decorative bows of domestic preparation, but the secure knots of professional necessity. Such skill indicated training that extended beyond ordinary village accomplishments. Miss Marple's afternoon was spent in what appeared to be routine social visits, but was actually a systematic investigation of alibis and opportunities. Her call upon Mrs. Hartwell revealed that several people had visited during the wedding favor preparation, offering assistance that had been politely declined. Her conversation with the verger confirmed that the vestry key had been borrowed briefly on the morning of the wedding by someone claiming to need access for last-minute arrangements. Most significantly, her discreet inquiries revealed that one member of the wedding party had arrived in Little Furlong several days before the ceremony, claiming to need time for rest and preparation, but actually conducting systematic reconnaissance of the village's routines and vulnerabilities. This individual had been present during the wedding favor preparation. had access to the vestry through professional connections, and possessed both the medical knowledge and criminal associations necessary to orchestrate the sophisticated murder plot. As evening approached, Miss Marple prepared for what she knew would be the most dangerous phase of her investigation. The killer remained among them, still trusted by the community, still capable of eliminating anyone who threatened to expose the carefully constructed deception that had transformed a village celebration into a scene of calculated murder. The criminal network's systematic elimination of witnesses demonstrated both their resources and their ruthlessness, making the final confrontation a matter of considerable personal risk. Yet she had observed something that gave her confidence in exposing the truth. Human nature, even under the most careful control, invariably revealed patterns that betrayed character and habit. The killer's meticulous preparation had left traces, not in obvious evidence that could be destroyed, but in the subtle behavioral patterns that distinguished professional expertise from amateur desperation. The wedding day secret was approaching its final revelation, but Miss Marple knew that such moments often provoked desperate actions from those who had killed twice and would not hesitate to kill again. The truth was emerging through careful observation of human behavior under pressure, and tomorrow would bring the confrontation that would either expose the real murderer or add another victim to the growing list of those who had learned too much about the deadly conspiracy that had invaded their peaceful village. The bells of St. Bartholomew's remained silent in the gathering mist, but Miss Marple could sense that justice was preparing to ring out across Little Furlong, bringing both resolution and reckoning to those who had thought themselves beyond the reach of village wisdom and divine retribution. The weight of accumulated evidence had crystallized in Miss Marple's mind during the long night, forming a pattern as clear and inevitable as the sunrise that now illuminated Little Furlong. She understood that confronting a killer required not dramatic accusations, but the careful application of psychological pressure that would compel the guilty party to reveal themselves through their own reactions. Human nature, she had learned through decades of observation, was remarkably consistent in its responses to exposure, and the most dangerous criminals often betrayed themselves through the very expertise that had enabled their crimes. Her morning was spent in what appeared to be routine social arrangements, but was actually the careful orchestration of a trap. She called upon the Reverend Clement with a suggestion that struck him as both pastorally sound and practically helpful. A small memorial tea for those most affected by recent tragedies, to be held at the vicarage where comfort and privacy could be assured. The invitation list was deliberately limited. Captain Ashford, Dr. Haydock, Mrs. Hartwell and Sylvia, and Miss Jennifer Fortescue, whose presence Miss Marple requested specifically for her assistance with floral arrangements. The tea began with a subdued conversation appropriate to such circumstances, each participant bearing the visible strain of events that had transformed their peaceful community into something approaching a battlefield. Mrs. Hartwell sat rigidly upright, her composure maintained through obvious effort. Sylvia appeared hollow-eyed with the particular exhaustion of someone whose world had been fundamentally altered. Captain Ashford made valiant attempts at military steadiness, while his gaze moved restlessly, as if seeking exits from an untenable position. Dr. Haydock poured tea with his customary professional attention to others' needs, though Miss Marple noted the careful way he observed each person's reactions and responses. It was Jennifer Fortescue who provided the brightness that the gathering desperately needed, her cheerful competence and genuine concern creating an atmosphere of normalcy that everyone gratefully embraced. "I thought we might discuss arrangements for a small memorial at the her vestry door," Miss Marple suggested gently. "Nothing elaborate, but perhaps some flowers with pretty ribbons to soften the association with recent tragedies." She produced materials she had prepared, lengths of pale ribbon and scraps of gauze cut to the exact dimensions of wedding favor ties. "My fingers are not what they were, I'm afraid. Perhaps someone with steadier hands might demonstrate the proper technique." Jennifer accepted the ribbon without hesitation, her manner suggesting someone accustomed to being helpful in practical matters. Her hands moved with unconscious efficiency, folding and securing the material with movements that spoke of long practice. The bow she created was neat and functional, but Miss Marple's experienced eye noted the particular characteristics that distinguished it from purely decorative work. "How very capable," Miss Marple observed mildly. "Such a secure knot. It reminds me of the techniques we used during the difficult winters when bandages needed to stay firmly in place. One learns to tie for durability rather than appearance." The slightest pause traveled through Jennifer's fingers before she laughed, with what might have been excessive lightness. "Just habit, I suppose. One ties what one knows best." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed. "Habits are such revealing things. They persist long after we think we've left them behind." She accepted the finished bow with apparent satisfaction, while noting how Jennifer's hands had automatically executed the additional twist that flattened and secured the knot, a technique that required specific training to become instinctive. The conversation drifted to other matters, but Miss Marple continued her gentle observations. "You must maintain such a well-stocked medical bag, my dear," she commented, indicating Jennifer's leather handbag. "I can detect the faintest trace of camphor even now, so distinctive. Poor Mr. Albright's office had that same medicinal quality when I visited yesterday. One wonders how such scents travel." Jennifer's hand moved swiftly toward her handbag clasp before stopping with obvious effort. "Hospital environments leave their mark," she replied with careful casualness. "The odors linger terribly on uniforms and equipment." Dr. Haydock's contribution proved inadvertently illuminating. "Yet you haven't been in active service for some time, have you? I believe Mrs. Bantry mentioned you left St. Catherine's last spring." "One never stops being useful," Jennifer responded, though her smile had acquired a tightness that hadn't been present earlier. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her movement allowing a glimpse into Jennifer's partially open handbag. The faintest shimmer of gauze and the thin line of blue thread confirmed what she had suspected. Physical evidence that connected Jennifer directly to the crime scenes. "I've been thinking about the morning of the wedding," Miss Marple continued conversationally. "So many small details that seemed insignificant at the time. The verger mentioned that someone had borrowed the vestry key to check the bridesmaids' bouquets. Such thoughtful attention to detail, though I wonder if the arrangements required quite so much adjustment." A flush rose in Jennifer's cheeks before being quickly suppressed. "Everything was rather chaotic that morning," she said carefully. "One wanted to ensure everything was perfect for Sylvia's special day." "Of course," Miss Marple agreed, "though I find it curious how certain skills reveal themselves under pressure. The knot you just tied, for instance. That particular technique is taught in medical training for securing bandages and surgical dressings. Once learned for professional purposes, it tends to be used automatically, whether for ribbons, gauze, or even the ties on small packets of sugared almonds." The room seemed to contract around those words, leaving them suspended in suddenly charged air. Captain Ashford drew a sharp breath. Mrs. Hartwell's teacup rattled against its saucer, and Sylvia looked from face to face as if seeking an explanation that would make sense of what she was hearing. Jennifer's composure held for a moment longer before beginning to fracture around the edges. "Are you suggesting that these tragic accidents were somehow—" "Not accidents," Miss Marple said with gentle certainty. "The medical precision involved, the graduated concentrations of poison, the systematic elimination of potential witnesses. These were the work of someone with professional training and criminal associations that extended far beyond our village boundaries." The psychological pressure was having its intended effect. Jennifer's careful mask was slipping, revealing glimpses of the calculating mind beneath. Her hand tightened on her handbag, as if it contained not just evidence, but some form of protection. "You cannot possibly prove such wild accusations," she said, though her voice lacked its earlier confidence. "Perhaps not in a court of law," Miss Marple acknowledged, but the county infirmary keeps excellent records of medical supplies dispensed, including the camphorated oil obtained on the morning of the wedding using a forged note with Mrs. Hartwell's signature. The handwriting analysis will be most illuminating, I believe. And the gauze packet currently in your possession, the one with the blue ribbon bearing the distinctive knot pattern, will provide physical evidence of your involvement. Jennifer's composure finally shattered completely. The pleasant, helpful young woman disappeared, replaced by someone whose eyes held the cold calculation of professional criminality. "You have no idea what forces you're challenging," she said quietly. "There are people involved in this who make village tragedies seem like children's games." "There always are," Miss Marple replied with surprising gentleness. "And they invariably abandon their agents when exposure becomes inconvenient. I suspect you're beginning to understand that your usefulness to Mr. Henderson and his associates has reached its end." The sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor announced Inspector Slack's arrival, summoned by Miss Marple's earlier message. As Jennifer Fortescue was led away, still maintaining her dignity despite the circumstances, Miss Marple reflected on the tragic irony of a young woman whose medical training, intended to preserve life, had been perverted into an instrument of systematic murder. The wedding day secret had finally been exposed, revealing not just local corruption, but a sophisticated criminal network that used respectable professionals to conduct their deadly business. Justice would be served, but the cost in human suffering had been considerable for all involved. As the village began the long process of healing from its ordeal, Miss Marple sat quietly with her knitting, reflecting once again on the eternal truth that evil often wore the most pleasant masks, and that the greatest dangers frequently came from those we trusted most completely. The bells of St. Bartholomew's would ring again, but Little Furlong would never quite return to its former innocence. The silence that followed Jennifer Fortescue's departure stretched through the vicarage drawing room like a physical presence, broken only by the distant sound of Inspector Slack's motor car departing with its grim cargo. Miss Marple observed the faces around her with the gentle attention she had always devoted to human nature in moments of crisis, noting how shock revealed character more clearly than comfort ever could. Captain Ashford was the first to speak, his voice hoarse with the effort of comprehension. "Jennifer Fortescue, all this time she was—" He could not finish the sentence, the enormity of the deception too vast for immediate acceptance. "A professional assassin," Miss Marple completed quietly. "Trained in medicine, recruited by criminal associates, and placed in our community months ago to establish the trust and access necessary for her purposes. Major Wickham's investigation threatened to expose a money laundering operation worth considerable sums, enough to justify systematic murder to protect it." Dr. Haydock, ever the professional, leaned forward with clinical interest despite his obvious distress. The medical precision involved, the graduated concentrations, the knowledge of toxicology, it all makes terrible sense now. She had the expertise to create exactly the effects she desired. Mrs. Hartwell's voice emerged as barely more than a whisper. She sat at my kitchen table. She helped me tie those ribbons, laughing about my attention to detail. All the while, she was planning to use our preparations for murder. Miss Marple nodded with compassionate understanding. That is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of professional criminality, the ability to perform genuine warmth while harboring the coldest calculation. Jennifer's medical training had taught her to observe human behavior with clinical detachment, making her performance all the more convincing. The formal explanation that followed revealed the full scope of the conspiracy that had invaded Little Furlong. Jennifer had arrived in the village 6 months earlier, establishing herself as a helpful young woman with nursing experience who had come to the countryside for rest and recovery. Her integration into village society had been systematic and deliberate, with particular attention to gaining access to the Hartwell household and the wedding preparations. The white ribbon substitution provided the perfect opportunity, Miss Marple explained. Jennifer recognized immediately how a distinctive packet could be used to ensure Major Wickham would select the fatal dose. His habit of choosing the unusual option was well known to anyone who had observed him socially. The multiple poisoned packets served two purposes: creating confusion about the method, while ensuring that if the primary target somehow avoided the white-ribboned favor, other guests would become ill enough to complicate any investigation. The physical evidence that had accumulated throughout the investigation now formed a coherent pattern. The sugar residue on the vestry key and around the church indicated Jennifer's nervous handling of the wedding favors during their preparation. The distinctive knotwork on the resealed packet found near Albright revealed her medical training, functional ties designed for security rather than appearance. The camphor odor that had lingered in both her medical bag and Albright's office showed how she had used medicinal compounds to mask the scent of aconite preparation. Most significantly, Miss Marple continued, the blue silk fiber beneath Major Wickham's fingernail told the story of his final moments. He had arrived early at the church, suspicious of something he could not quite identify. His examination of the wedding favor tray had led him to handle the packets, and his fingers had worried at one that had been opened and resealed. He knew something was wrong, but his gentleman's reluctance to voice suspicions without proof cost him his life. The investigation's expansion revealed the true scope of Henderson's criminal enterprise. Jennifer's arrest had provided authorities with intelligence that led to coordinated raids across London, exposing a sophisticated network that used provincial trust funds as cover for processing enormous sums from criminal activities. Mr. Hartwell's embezzlement had been discovered and exploited by the network, making him a reluctant accomplice through threats against his family. Edward Hartwell is guilty of financial impropriety, Miss Marple acknowledged, but his role in the murders was that of an unwilling tool rather than an active participant. The pressure applied by Henderson's associates, combined with threats against Sylvia's safety, had driven him to desperate compliance. His removal of the second, wedding favor after Major Wickham's collapse was panic rather than calculation. A foolish attempt to hide evidence he feared would implicate him further. The legal proceedings that followed provided justice tempered with understanding of the various pressures that had created the tragedy. Jennifer Fortescue was charged with 2 counts of murder and conspiracy, her confession revealing the systematic nature of the criminal network. Henderson himself remained beyond immediate reach, having fled to continental Europe, but his organization had been effectively dismantled through the arrests and prosecutions that followed. For the Hartwell family, the path forward required both legal resolution and personal healing. Mr. Hartwell faced charges for embezzlement, but received consideration for his cooperation and the coercion he had endured. The trust fund, now under proper management, would eventually be restored, though the family's reputation required patient reconstruction. Captain Ashford and Sylvia's marriage survived the ordeal, strengthened rather than weakened by the truth that had emerged. Their wedding had been transformed from celebration to tragedy, but their commitment to each other had been tested and proven genuine. The financial difficulties that had seemed so overwhelming were addressed through honest acknowledgement and systematic resolution rather than desperate deception. The village of Little Furlong slowly returned to its familiar rhythms, though the experience had left permanent changes in how residents viewed both their security and their relationships. The innocent tradition of wedding favors would forever carry subtle associations with the tragedy, and the community had learned that even the most peaceful English villages could harbor sophisticated criminal enterprises. Miss Marple returned to her garden and her knitting, reflecting on the eternal lessons that such cases provided about human nature. Evil often wore the most pleasant masks, and the greatest dangers frequently came from those who had earned complete trust through careful performance. Yet she had also witnessed the triumph of patient observation and community solidarity over criminal sophistication. The investigation had demonstrated that truth, like her beloved roses, required careful tending but would eventually bloom when provided with proper attention. The wedding day's secret had been exposed through the systematic application of village wisdom to complex problems, proving that ordinary human decency, when combined with keen observation and moral courage, could defeat even the most sophisticated criminal enterprises. As the bells of St. Bartholomew's prepared to ring again in celebration rather than mourning, Miss Marple knew that little Furlong had learned valuable lessons about both vulnerability and resilience. The price in human suffering had been considerable, but the victory of truth over deception provided hope that such ordeals could be survived and overcome through patience, wisdom, and the fundamental bonds that held communities together even in their darkest hours. The wedding day's secret had finally been revealed in all its terrible complexity, but from its exposure had come not just justice, but a deeper understanding of the eternal vigilance required to preserve the values and relationships that made civilized life possible. In her experience, that understanding was perhaps the most valuable legacy any tragedy could leave behind. The weeks that followed Jennifer Fortescue's arrest brought little Furlong the particular quality of peace that emerges after great storms, quieter than before, but charged with the wisdom that comes only through surviving genuine peril. Miss Marple observed this transformation from her garden, where the late summer roses bloomed with unusual abundance, as if nature itself were offering compensation for the darkness that had temporarily shadowed their peaceful village. The legal proceedings concluded with satisfying thoroughness, though their ramifications extended far beyond little Furlong's ancient boundaries. Jennifer Fortescue's trial revealed the full scope of her professional criminality, a trained nurse whose medical knowledge had been perverted into an instrument of systematic murder. Her confession, delivered with chilling detachment, detailed the instructions received from Henderson's network and the calculated planning that had transformed a wedding celebration into a scene of calculated assassination. The court's sentence ensured she would spend many years contemplating the choices that had led her from healing to murder. Henderson himself, caught attempting to flee through continental Europe, faced extradition and the systematic dismantling of his sophisticated criminal enterprise. The intelligence provided by Jennifer's arrest led to coordinated raids across multiple counties, exposing a network that had used respectable provincial professionals to process enormous sums from criminal activities. Mr. Hartwell's case presented more complex challenges. While his embezzlement was undeniable, the coercion he had suffered, combined with his genuine cooperation, earned him consideration from the court. His sentence, though severe, offered a path to rehabilitation rather than complete ruin. For the Hartwell family, recovery proved to be a gradual but ultimately complete process. Mrs. Hartwell emerged from the ordeal with her dignity intact, but her understanding of human nature fundamentally altered. The trust fund that had been the source of so much trouble was restored under proper management, providing security while serving as a permanent reminder of the vigilance required to protect one's interests. Her relationship with her husband survived the crisis, strengthened by the honesty that finally replaced years of careful concealment about their difficulties. Sylvia and Captain Ashford's marriage, tested in the crucible of tragedy, emerged stronger for the experience. The young woman had discovered reserves of strength she had not known she possessed, while her husband's steady support during the legal proceedings earned him the respect of those who might otherwise have judged him harshly. The financial settlement that had once seemed so crucial was quietly restructured to protect both parties, while addressing legitimate debts through honest means rather than deceptive manipulation. Among the most poignant discoveries was a letter found in Mr. Albright's office, a final communication from Major Wickham that had been set aside and forgotten in the chaos of recent events. Miss Marple delivered it personally to Mrs. Hartwell, reading aloud the Major's careful words. "I have come across matters in your household accounts that compel me to speak plainly, though I would spare you pain if I could. You are owed honesty, and your daughter is owed safety. I am placing copies of certain papers in the vicar's hands in case anything should happen to me. If I am mistaken, I will ask your forgiveness and take my leave. If I am not, you will need friends around you who will insist upon daylight. I count myself among them." The letter provided a measure of closure that official proceedings could not offer, revealing Major Wickham's genuine concern for the family's welfare and his prescient understanding of the dangers surrounding them. When Mrs. Hartwell finished listening, she said simply, "He was a good man," and for the first time since the tragedy, her tears were healing rather than bitter. The village itself absorbed the lessons of the crisis with characteristic English pragmatism. The residents had learned to be more cautious about accepting newcomers at face value, while maintaining the fundamental hospitality that made community life possible. The balance between openness and prudence would require ongoing attention, but Miss Marple was confident that little Furlong possessed the wisdom to navigate such challenges successfully. Dr. Haydock's role in exposing the medical aspects of the crime enhanced his already considerable reputation, though he remained characteristically modest about his contributions. His systematic analysis of the poison evidence had provided the foundation for the legal case, demonstrating how professional integrity could serve justice even in the most complex circumstances. The Reverend Clement restored St. Bartholomew's to its proper spiritual atmosphere through patient attention to both practical and symbolic details, gradually replacing the church's association with tragedy through renewed focus on its sacred purposes. As autumn approached and the village settled into its familiar rhythms, Miss Marple reflected on the various lessons the wedding day tragedy had provided about the eternal struggle between good and evil in human affairs. The case had demonstrated how sophisticated criminal enterprises could infiltrate even the most peaceful communities, but it had also shown how ordinary human decency, when combined with careful observation and moral courage, could expose and defeat such threats. Most significantly, the investigation had reinforced her belief that truth, however painful, was preferable to comfortable deceptions. The secrets that had made the tragedy possible had thrived in an atmosphere of polite concealment and reluctance to acknowledge unpleasant realities. The exposure of those secrets had been traumatic, but ultimately healing, allowing honest relationships to replace the careful performances that had concealed so much danger. The wedding day that had begun with such promise had indeed revealed secrets, though not the pleasant mysteries that guests might have expected. The truth that emerged had been dark and disturbing, but its exposure had ultimately strengthened rather than weakened the bonds that held the community together. The price in human suffering had been considerable, but the victory of justice over sophisticated criminality provided hope that such ordeals could be survived and overcome. As she sat with her knitting in the gathering twilight, Miss Marple could hear the bells of St. Bartholomew's preparing for evening prayers, their bronze voices carrying promises of continuity and renewal across the village green. The wedding day secret had been fully revealed, its terrible complexity exposed, and its perpetrators brought to justice. Little Furlong was returning to its familiar rhythms, wiser for its ordeal and stronger for having faced the darkness and emerged into the light. The investigation was complete, but the lessons it had provided would endure, that the most ordinary communities could harbor extraordinary secrets, that the most pleasant faces could conceal the most dangerous intentions, and that truth, when pursued with patience and courage, would always find a way to emerge from even the most carefully constructed deceptions. In Miss Marple's experience, such understanding was perhaps the most valuable legacy any tragedy could leave behind, ensuring that future generations would be better equipped to recognize and resist the forces that threatened their peace and security. The bells continued their ancient rhythm, calling the faithful to prayer and reflection, while Miss Marple smiled quietly to herself, knowing that in Little Furlong, as in villages everywhere, the eternal vigilance of ordinary people would always prove stronger than the sophisticated schemes of those who chose darkness over light. The days following Jennifer Fortescue's arrest brought Little Furlong the particular quality of relief that emerges when a long-held breath is finally released. Miss Marple observed this transformation from her morning position in the garden, noting how truth, once exposed, seemed to lighten the very air that the villagers breathed. The investigation had concluded with satisfying thoroughness, but the human aftermath required its own careful attention. Dr. Haydock's final medical report provided the concrete closure that official minds required. Jennifer's confession had revealed the full scope of her professional training in toxicology, acquired not through legitimate medical education, but through her association with Henderson's criminal network. The graduated concentrations of aconite in the wedding favors had been calculated with chilling precision, the white-ribboned packet containing a lethal dose for Major Wickham, while the others held amounts designed to create illness and confusion without necessarily causing death. The physical evidence that Miss Marple had so carefully observed throughout the investigation now formed a coherent pattern that satisfied even Inspector Slack's methodical requirements. The distinctive knotwork on the resealed packets, the sugar residue from nervous handling, the camphor traces from medical storage, all pointed to someone with professional expertise operating under considerable pressure. Jennifer's medical bag, when finally searched, yielded not only the remaining gauze and ribbon, but also a small vial of concentrated aconite extract, prepared with the precision that only advanced chemical knowledge could provide. Henderson's capture in Dover, attempting to flee to continental Europe, brought the criminal network's activities to a definitive end. The intelligence provided by Jennifer's arrest had enabled coordinated raids across multiple counties, exposing a sophisticated money laundering operation that had used provincial trust funds as cover for processing enormous sums from criminal activities. Mr. Hartwell's embezzlement, while serious, proved to be a relatively minor component of a much larger criminal enterprise. For the immediate participants in the tragedy, recovery began with the kind of honest conversations that should have occurred much earlier. Captain Ashford's financial difficulties, no longer hidden behind desperate schemes, could be addressed through systematic planning and community support. His marriage to Sylvia, tested in the crucible of public scrutiny, emerged stronger for having been founded on truth rather than carefully maintained deceptions. The Hartwell family faced their own reckoning with characteristic dignity. Mr. Hartwell's cooperation with authorities, combined with genuine remorse for his role in enabling the criminal network, earned him consideration from the court. The trust fund, now under proper supervision, would eventually be restored, though the family's reputation required patient reconstruction through demonstrated integrity rather than social position. Mrs. Hartwell's strength throughout the ordeal had impressed even Miss Marple, who had observed many people under similar pressure. The lady's decision to preserve crucial documents in the vicarage safe had provided authorities with the evidence needed to expose the full scope of the criminal conspiracy. Her loyalty to her family, tempered by recognition of moral boundaries, demonstrated the kind of principled behavior that made community healing possible. As the immediate crisis passed and Little Furlong began to settle into familiar rhythms, Miss Marple reflected on the eternal lessons that such cases provided about human nature. The wedding day tragedy had demonstrated how sophisticated criminal enterprises could infiltrate even the most peaceful communities, but it had also shown how ordinary human decency, when aroused to vigilance and action, proved more than capable of exposing and defeating such threats. The investigation had reinforced her belief that the most dangerous criminals were often not the obviously wicked, but the apparently respectable individuals who had learned to perform warmth and helpfulness while harboring the coldest calculation. Jennifer Fortescue's medical training had taught her to observe human behavior with clinical detachment, making her deception all the more convincing and her crimes all the more chilling. Yet the case had also revealed the fundamental strength of community bonds when tested by genuine crisis. The villagers had supported each other through suspicion and fear, ultimately choosing truth over comfortable deception and justice over social convenience. The wedding favors that had been intended as symbols of celebration and turned into instruments of murder would not be allowed to poison the tradition itself. Little Furlong would continue to celebrate marriages and mark joyous occasions, but with the wisdom that came from understanding how precious such innocence truly was. As evening approached and the bells of St. Bartholomew's called the faithful to evening prayers, Miss Marple settled into her favorite chair with her knitting, listening to the familiar sounds of a village returning to peace. The wedding day secret had been fully revealed, its perpetrators brought to justice, and its victims honored through the community's commitment to ensuring that such tragedies would not be repeated. The investigation was complete, but its lessons would endure. That evil often wore pleasant masks, that the most ordinary communities could harbor extraordinary secrets, and that truth, when pursued with patience and courage, would always find a way to emerge from even the most carefully constructed deceptions. In Miss Marple's experience, such understanding was perhaps the most valuable legacy any tragedy could leave behind, ensuring that future generations would be better equipped to recognize and resist the forces that threatened their peace and security. The bells continued their ancient rhythm in the gathering darkness, calling the community to reflection and renewal. Miss Marple smiled quietly to herself, knowing that in Little Furlong, as in villages everywhere, the eternal vigilance of ordinary people would always prove stronger than the sophisticated schemes of those who chose darkness over light. The wedding day that had begun with such promise and descended into tragedy had ultimately become a testament to the triumph of community wisdom over criminal sophistication. Tomorrow would bring ordinary concerns, letters to post, gardens to tend, neighbors to visit, and in that return to normalcy lay the truest proof that justice had been done and healing had begun. The extraordinary had been endured. The ordinary could now resume, enriched by the knowledge that even the darkest secrets could not long survive the patient application of truth and the persistent courage of those who refused to accept convenient lies when evidence pointed toward more complex realities.